Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Today's March 8, 2004, and we're conducting an interview for the HistoryMakers. My name is Donna Elam, and with us we have our videographer, Scott Stearns, Larry Crow, Reggie Poe, and Jason Poe as observers. Please state your full name.
Frederick Douglass Reese.
And please spell that for us.
Frederick Douglass Reese.
And your date and place of birth.
November the 28th, 1929, in Selma, Alabama.
Plus just one.
Okay. All right. And your occupation?
I'm a retired educator. I'm now pastoring the Ebenezer Baptist Church here in Selma, Alabama.
Oh. And your educational background?
My educational background, elementary education here in Selma at Clark Elementary School, high school, Knox Academy, Alabama A&M, Alabama State University, and Livingston University.
Thank you. We have heard stories and we've read in the history books about the Courageous Eight. Can you share with us your understanding and your involvement with the Courageous Eight?
The Courageous Eight identification was given to 8 persons who were part of the official staff of the Dallas County Voters League, the officers of that league. In 1964, the Dallas County Voters League, which was the local civil rights organization that sponsored the movement here, the voting rights movement, was under an injunction by the Circuit Court here, prohibiting any further mass meetings in churches, nor could those officers be allowed to congregate on streets discussing the right to vote. If so, we would be arrested. And therefore, we decided that we would still meet the officers, even in light of that injunction. There were 8 of us who kept the fire burning, so to speak, in connection with the ongoing activities for the Voters League, although we were not allowed to meet in churches to hold mass meetings, nor to discuss voting on the streets of Selma. So we met in homes and in offices, the 8 of us, in order to maintain our commitment to make sure that those persons who had been denied the right to vote would have that right, even in the face of the injunction that we were under. And so it was that in December of 1964, we decided that we would no longer let that injunction keep us from pursuing the right to vote. So then we invited to Selma Dr. King and the members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to come to Selma to further assist us in our quest for the right to vote. It was in December of 1964 in Mrs. Amelia Boynton's house that I signed the official invitation inviting Dr. King and the members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to come to Selma to further assist us in our quest for the right to vote, because prior to that time, SNCC was invited, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, after 1963, and therefore they were the pioneers in trying to lead those persons who had been disenfranchised with the members of the Dallas County Voters League to encourage people who were living on plantations and in the county area to really go down to the county courthouse to file application to become registered voters. And that took place from beginning of 1964 until July, during the time when that injunction was issued. There were many arrests being made during that period of time. And of course, the Dallas County Voters League, which was the local organization that sponsored the movement here, then chose to embrace SNCC. And of course, during that particular time, they were here in Selma, using the benefit of those persons who were part of that organization to go out into the county to help encourage people to become registered. And that continued until the injunction was issued. And therefore, SNCC, which was the first organization to come to Selma to assist us in our quest for the right to vote. And so then in December, as I mentioned before, in Mrs. Amelia Bunder's house, I signed the invitation after the influence of SNCC had dwindled because there were philosophical differences within the SNCC organization, which made them somewhat ineffective. And of course, then in order for everyone to know that SCLC had been asked to come in and not to replace, in a sense, the efforts that SNCC had made, but they were officially invited by the Dallas County Voters League, which was the local organization here. And of course, and that is when I signed the official invitation inviting Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to come to Selma. And that was in December of 1964. And it was at that meeting that we decided that we would break that injunction, no longer allow that injunction to keep us from pursuing the right to vote. And we decided that on January the 2nd, 1965, at Brown Chapel Church, we would meet to break that injunction by calling a mass meeting at Brown Chapel. It was the day before January the 2nd. I can never forget that day. January the 1st. And usually in Dallas County, Selma, we celebrate the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation here every January the 1st. And that day had been proclaimed, and we had organized for observing that particular emancipation. And so we could not have that mass meeting on the 1st because we had planned for the Emancipation Proclamation celebration. Therefore, we had to go to January the 2nd. And it snowed the day before. And there were those who thought no one would show up at Brown Chapel AME Church because everyone knew about that injunction that we were under. And so 3 o'clock, January the 2nd, 1965, in Brown Chapel Church, the church became filled with citizens of Selma. They were standing on the outside, understanding that they would be threatened with arrest. And so after observing those persons who were there, the law enforcement agencies came around and with the public safety director and the police chief to observe the breaking of that injunction. And when they got there and saw the number of people in that church and around the church, I should imagine they remembered that possibly the little jail downtown couldn't have held all of us, nor could they afford to feed all of us down there. So then that injunction became nil and void. And we then resumed our mass meetings, rotating mass meetings in churches here in Selma. And then that particular incident moved toward January the 22nd, 1965, at which time I led the first group of teachers to demonstrate for the right to vote in the United States, right here in Selma, Alabama, coming out of Clark Elementary School, the elementary school I attended, down Lawrence Street, down to Alabama Avenue, down to the county courthouse, and leading over 100 of those teachers. And we walked double file. And the person that who walked with me, he was my 10th grade biology teacher. His name was Mr. A.J. Durgan. And we led those teachers down to the county courthouse. We had already sent, in fact, I had sent a registered letter to the Board of Registrars asking that they would be open Friday, January the 22nd, to allow teachers to file application to become registered. Well, I knew that. They never open on Friday. The only day for registration is on Monday, and of course the first and third Mondays. But I wanted to just document the fact that they were asked to have that office open on Friday. I thought that, really, if I could go to the courthouse and pay my taxes in the day of the week, do other business in the courthouse in the day of the week, I ought to be able to go to the courthouse and register. So therefore, that was the intent behind that registered letter I sent to the chairman of the Board of Registrar. And then after getting that to the county courthouse that day, we went up those steps, and across those steps leading to the door of the Alabama street side, there were deputies across the door with their billy clubs, with their guns, and the vicious sheriff, Jim Clark, who at that time was a symbol of resistance here in the South. And he gave the orders for us to get off of those steps, that we were making a mockery out of his courthouse. And we reminded him that that courthouse also belonged to us, and that we were not backing down from the right to go in to the courthouse to see if the Board of Registrars was open so that teachers could be registered. And he assured us that the board was not in session. Well, I knew it wasn't anyway. But I told him we had a right to go and see for ourselves. And he gave us a minute to move off of those steps. And after that minute expired, he took the billy clubs and jabbed us down those steps on the sidewalk. And my partner, my 10th grade teacher, well, he was not quite used to that kind of thing as I was. And so getting on the sidewalk, he asked me the question. So what shall we do? Well, he had kind of big, pretty eyes, I said, we are going back. He said, I said, we are going back. And so we regrouped and went back up the steps. He gave us one additional minute to move, because we had already decided I really wanted to get every teacher arrested. It's really what I wanted to do, because teachers in Selma, Dallas County represented the largest professional, black professional group in Dallas County. And teachers did not really understand the influence they had in the community as an organization, as a professional group. And so making that particular march then opened their eyes, not only the teachers, but other merchants in town whose businesses that teachers had accommodated. And so the second time we went up, he jabbed us down the steps the second time. And then the same question was asked me, and the same answer given to my partner, that we were going back. We went back up the third time, and he indicated that if we did not get off of those steps, that he was going to arrest us. But I said to myself, it's exactly what I really want you to do. But then about 45 seconds had expired from that minute. And someone on the inside of the courthouse came and pulled Jim Clark inside too. Now, I didn't go in there with him, but I can imagine what they told him. For goodness sake, do not arrest those teachers. And so instead of arresting us at the expiration of that minute, he came back out and jabbed us down the steps the third time. And so I knew then that we're not going to get arrested. So then I gave orders for the teachers to regroup, and we again began that line of march, not back to Clark Elementary School, but to Brown Chapel A&B Church. And there those teachers received a hero's welcome. There was parents who had really followed the teachers all the way from Clark Elementary School to the county courthouse and then back to Brown Chapel Church. And when we walked in, Brown Chapel was filled with citizens, particularly around those who live in the project area around Brown Chapel. And that was a tremendous moment for the movement because the teachers held in high esteem by people in the community. And now, although prior to that time, you had persons who were not professional as such, but the common laity who had been a part of the movement from 1964. And many arrests been made, young people, as well as some adults. But now, for the first time, teachers were involved in that movement. It was the Teachers' March, really, that made that movement, that gave it the momentum it needed. After having been under that injunction, the momentum that it needed was given by those teachers. And so from that point on, there was an effort on the part of the Dallas County Voters League to actually make real the system of trying to enlist the cooperation and the participation of other persons in the community who had not been involved. And so it was then the movement gained momentum, and there were members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, field workers, who then spread out over the county and even went to Marion, Alabama, which is about 35 miles from Selma. And there were field workers who in Marion who were trying to get those people involved in pursuing the right to vote. And of course, that lull after the Teachers' March and those members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference who were field workers then went to Marion. And in Marion, Alabama, there was planned a night march. And that night march, which was connected with the county courthouse and the church there in the county square. And the state troopers who were observing that night march, with preparation for the night march, I know it was stated that the lights were shot out around the church. And of course, then the state troopers then began to moving on those persons who were part of the mass meeting. And Jimmy Lee Jackson, the first martyr of the voting rights movement, went in a cafe to try to protect his mother from the onslaught of those state troopers. He was shot, and he was brought to Selma, and he expired in the hospital here in Selma. And that death enraged the civil rights community. And the idea was proposed that we would take Jimmy Lee Jackson's body and place it on the steps of the Capitol so that the governor would know that there are persons in not only Selma, Dallas County, Perry County, but all over the South, who were being denied basic rights. And that to give him an idea of the quality of life that existed in the communities in these particular counties. And so that idea of addressing those needs to the governor came forth from the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson. And so that idea was taken back to SCLC, and the board adopted the idea that we would accept the idea of a march from Selma to Montgomery to actually protest the kind of denial that had been perpetrated by state troopers and others, blacks, minorities, who had been denied the right to vote. And so it was decided that we would then make that march on March 7th, 1965. And on that particular day, around Brown Chapel Church, I was pastoring out in about 8 miles from Selma, a church, Macedonia Baptist Church. I left the morning worship and came to Brown Chapel Church because at 3 o'clock we were to begin that march. And getting on Brown Chapel's grounds, there were many people that were ready to participate in that march. And my particular responsibility was to make sure that those persons participating in the march would at least march at least 3 feet apart, because I was aware of the ordinance here in the city of Selma, which prohibited any parading any less than 3 feet. And I didn't want those marchers to get arrested before they got across the bridge. So therefore I stood there and made sure that those persons who were marching double file from Brown Chapel would at least leave there at least 3 feet apart. And of course, then after the line of march left Brown Chapel, and at that time the street on which Brown Chapel is located was named Sylvan Street. And of course, it was not named Martin Luther King Jr. Street until later years after 1972, when I was elected to the city council here, and I proposed that ordinance to change that street from Sylvan Street to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Street. And of course, after several attempts, then we finally got it. It's a long story, but we finally got it changed. But that march that day, March the 7th, left Brown Chapel Church, went down Sylvan Street, later Martin Luther King Jr. Street, down to Alabama Avenue, and down west on Alabama Avenue to Broad Street. And Broad Street is a street that runs right across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And we made a left on Broad Street, going across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And when we got to the apex of that bridge, I observed something. I saw on the other side a sea of blue helmets, blue state trooper uniform, blue state trooper cars, state trooper parked. Those state troopers who were lined across the Highway 80 East with their billy clubs, their gas masks, their gas canisters. And that was the leader of the state trooper. His name was Major Cloud, and he had a bullhorn. And he announced that we were to disperse and go back to our homes at the church, that he had an order from the governor not to allow that march to continue. And we had already decided that we would not turn unless we would turn. And so he gave orders for those marchers, for those state troopers rather, to move in on the marchers with their billy clubs clutched on both ends, literally moving down the line of marchers, toppling marchers over as if you would topple bowling pins in a bowling alley. And then he gave orders for the state troopers to withdraw, and they began to beat heads. I saw blood flowing. Pandemonium broke out in the crowd, and there was a state of disbelief that this was happening in these United States of America. And so then they withdrew and then got the gas canisters and lobbed them over into the marchers. And if you've ever been in gas, you have to try to find some fresh air. And so the marchers then moved to the east side of the highway, just opposite the bridge here. And behind that particular building was a field. And we went behind that building in the field to get out of the gas. After about 20 minutes, we came from behind the building back toward the highway, going back across the bridge, going back to Brown Chapel. And the state troopers at that point did not inflict any further punishment on us. So we had to walk through this line of state troopers. At the end of the line of state troopers was the chef posse. These were men who were deputized by the chef department, Jim Clark, who were on horseback. They had the long billy sticks, and then they began to pursue us as if they were going to run over us as we were going back across the bridge on the way back to Brown Chapel Church. And of course, on that bridge, yes, I was beaten again with the long billy sticks, and as if the horses were going to run over us. And those of us who were able to get back to Brown Chapel Church, because there were some who were injured, who were not able to get back, and they didn't allow the ambulance to really go and get those persons until, I guess, 30 minutes later. But getting back to Brown Chapel Church, those of us who could, I'll never forget that day. We sat in the sanctuary, those marchers, and I looked into the eyes of those marchers, whose eyes I looked into many days before then as president of the Dallas County Voters League. I saw a question mark, and that question mark was whether or not we should pursue the nonviolent method based on what happened across this bridge here from that point on. And so while in the sanctuary that day, the telephone rang in the pastor stood in Brown Chapel Church. It was Dr. King. He called me. He said, "Mr. President," well, he called Mr. President because he was always awed at a teacher leading a movement. He said, "Mr. President, I understand you had a little trouble down in Selma." He was in Atlanta, Georgia. I said, "Dr. King," I said, "that's an understatement you're making." I said, "We've had a lot of trouble here." Well, he's being facetious, but he said, "I sent out a call over the nation inviting ministers and persons who would come to Selma to assist the people of Selma in their quest for the right to vote." And while in the sanctuary that very night, about 10 o'clock, a group of persons had chartered a plane from New Jersey, had come to Montgomery, Alabama, and chartered a bus. And while we were in the sanctuary in Brown Chapel Church, they walked in that door and said, "We are here because we have seen what happened on the television screen today, and we have heard the call of Dr. King, and we are here to lend our bodies and our assistance to the people of Selma." And I can assure you that was one of the most exhilarating and most inspiring moments of that day, because then you had the feeling that there were others who were concerned about the plight that we were under in pursuing the right to vote.